November 10, 2001. Outside Mazar-e-Sharif, northern Afghanistan. Captain Mark Nutch sat on horseback watching 500 Taliban fighters retreat toward a fortified position 2 kilometers away. Behind them were T-55 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and anti-aircraft guns mounted on trucks. In front of him were 12 Green Berets on horses and a ragtag militia armed with AK-47s and RPGs. This was not how modern warfare was supposed to look. Nutch pulled out his laser designator and painted one of the Taliban tanks. Seconds later, a 2,000-pound bomb dropped from an Air Force bomber invisible in the sky above. The explosion was so massive it knocked men off their horses a kilometer away. The tank simply ceased to exist. Welcome to the strangest battle of the 21st century. 12 American Special Forces soldiers, none of whom knew how to ride a horse 3 weeks earlier, were about to liberate a major Afghan city on horseback while calling in precision airstrikes from bombers flying at 30,000 feet. Military planners had predicted 80% of them would be dead within days. Instead, they accomplished in 23 days what generals thought would take 2 years. This is the story of ODA 595, the Horse Soldiers, and how America's response to September 11th began with the last cavalry charge in U.S. military history. September 11th, 2001. Everyone remembers where they were. Captain Mark Nutch was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 5th Special Forces Group. He watched the towers fall on television like everyone else, and like every other Green Beret in that building, he had one immediate thought: we're going to Afghanistan. The Taliban had harbored al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden was hiding somewhere in those mountains. America wanted revenge, and Special Forces were going to deliver it. The only question was how. Afghanistan wasn't Iraq with open desert and modern infrastructure. It was one of the most isolated, primitive, and mountainous countries on Earth. The Soviet Union had invaded with 100,000 men and lost. What could 12-man teams accomplish? The answer came from an unexpected source: the Northern Alliance. These were Afghan warlords and militias who'd been fighting the Taliban for years. They knew the terrain. They had local support. They just lacked one thing: American firepower. If Special Forces teams could link up with Northern Alliance commanders and coordinate airstrikes, they could turn a guerrilla army into a legitimate fighting force. ODA 595 was selected for one of the first insertions. 12 men. Captain Mark Nutch as team leader. Chief Warrant Officer Bob Pennington as his second. 10 more Green Berets with specialties in weapons, communications, engineering, and medicine. Their mission: infiltrate northern Afghanistan, link up with a warlord named General Abdul Rashid Dostum, and help him capture the city of Mazar-e-Sharif. Mazar-e-Sharif was critical. It was the largest city in northern Afghanistan and sat on key supply routes from Uzbekistan. If the Northern Alliance could take it, the Taliban's entire northern defensive line would collapse. CIA estimated it would take 18 months to 2 years to accomplish this, assuming everything went perfectly. ODA 595 would do it in 3 weeks, on horseback. October 17, 2001. ODA 595 received their final mission briefing at K2 Air Base in Uzbekistan. Intelligence officers laid out the plan. Maps showed insertion points, Taliban positions, and Northern Alliance territory. Everything seemed straightforward until someone mentioned transportation. The briefer said casually, "Be prepared to use indigenous animals for transport." The room went silent. Indigenous animals? One of the team members finally asked what that meant. The answer was horses. They'd be riding horses. None of them knew how to ride. They were Special Forces operators trained in advanced weapon systems, demolitions, foreign languages, and unconventional warfare. Horseback riding was not in the curriculum. They had 48 hours to figure it out. The team scrambled to find any information they could. They watched YouTube videos. They called ranchers back in the States asking for advice. The answers they got were not encouraging. Real riding took months to learn. You needed proper saddles. You needed to build a relationship with the animal. Doing it wrong could cripple you. And doing it wrong while carrying 80 pounds of gear and weapons in combat conditions? Good luck. Military leadership was blunt about the odds. 80% casualties expected in the first few days. The terrain was brutal. The enemy was entrenched. Winter was coming. And if something went wrong, extraction might be impossible. This wasn't a conventional mission with backup and air support on standby. This was a small team going deep into enemy territory with no safety net. October 19, 2001, 3 a.m. ODA 595 loaded onto two MH-47 Chinook helicopters, along with several 50-pound bags of oats for the horses they hadn't met yet. They flew low and fast through mountain passes in complete darkness. Taliban radar sites were scattered throughout the region. If they were detected, the helicopters would be shot down, and there would be no rescue. The insertion point was a barren valley controlled by Dostum's forces. The helicopters touched down briefly, just long enough for the team to jump out with their gear. Then the Chinooks disappeared back into the night, and ODA 595 was alone in Afghanistan. What they found when they met General Dostum made them question whether this mission was even possible. General Abdul Rashid Dostum was not what American military planners expected from an Allied commander. He was a brutal warlord who'd switched sides multiple times during Afghanistan's decades of civil war. He'd fought for the Soviets, then against them, then for various Mujahideen factions, and now against the Taliban. He was brilliant, ruthless, and completely unpredictable. When Captain Nutch met Dostum for the first time, the warlord was sitting in a compound surrounded by armed men. Dostum spoke through a translator and got straight to the point. He had several hundred cavalry fighters, mostly Uzbek and Tajik militia members, who'd been fighting in these mountains their entire lives. They were tough, brave, and willing to die, but they were facing Taliban forces with tanks, artillery, and thousands of fighters dug into defensive positions. Dostum wanted to know what the Americans could do. Nuch explained they could call in airstrikes with pinpoint accuracy. Show them a target, any target, and they'd destroy it. Dostum was skeptical. The Soviets had bombed Afghanistan for 10 years and accomplished nothing. What made the Americans different? The answer was precision. Soviet bombing was area saturation. Drop enough explosives and eventually you hit something. American bombing in 2001 was surgical. GPS-guided munitions could hit a specific building, a specific vehicle, even a specific window. All ODA 595 needed was eyes on the target and a way to communicate with bombers overhead. But first, they needed horses. Dostum's men brought them forward, small, sturdy Afghan horses that looked nothing like the large breeds Americans were familiar with. No saddles, just blankets and rope. The Green Berets climbed on awkwardly, trying to remember the YouTube videos they'd watched 2 days earlier. It was immediately clear this was going to be painful. The horses moved differently than expected. The terrain was rocky and steep. Every muscle in their legs and backs screamed after the first hour. And they had to do this while carrying M4 rifles, radios, laser designators, medical kits, and ammunition. One team member later joked that riding into combat was the most painful thing he'd ever experienced, and he'd been through Ranger School. But pain was about to be the least of their problems, because the Taliban was waiting, and the first battle would prove whether this insane plan could actually work. October 21, 2001. The first combat test came at a Taliban position near the village of Kobaki. Dostum's cavalry, several hundred riders, prepared to charge a fortified position held by Taliban fighters with machine guns and mortars. The Green Berets watched in disbelief. This was going to be a massacre. But Dostum had a plan. He'd done this before against better armed enemies. The key was speed and surprise. His cavalry would charge from multiple directions simultaneously, closing the distance before the Taliban could coordinate their fire. The Americans would provide covering fire and call in airstrikes on any heavy weapons. The charge began. Hundreds of horses thundering across open ground toward enemy positions. Taliban fighters opened fire. Machine gun tracers streaked across the battlefield. Mortars began dropping. And then the first American bomb hit. A Taliban machine gun nest simply disappeared in a cloud of dust and fire. Seconds later, another explosion took out a mortar position. The Taliban fighters, who'd been confident in their defensive positions, suddenly realized they were being obliterated by weapons they couldn't see. Panic spread. Some tried to retreat. Others kept fighting. But the combination of precision airstrikes and cavalry charges was overwhelming. Within an hour, the Taliban position was overrun. Dostum's men swept through the compound, killing or capturing everyone who hadn't fled. ODA 595 had proven the concept worked. A small team with laser designators and radio contact with bombers could multiply the effectiveness of a primitive cavalry force by a factor of 10. But this was just a small outpost. Mazar-e-Sharif was a different problem entirely. The Taliban had fortified the city with thousands of fighters, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles, and artillery positions on the surrounding ridgelines. Capturing it would require a coordinated assault on multiple fronts against an enemy that had every defensive advantage. Dostum's plan was audacious. He would split his forces and attack from 3 directions simultaneously. The Americans would move with the main cavalry force and direct airstrikes against the heaviest Taliban positions. If they could break through the outer defenses and reach the city outskirts, the Taliban garrison might collapse. If they failed, everyone would die. November 9, 2001. The assault on Mazar-e-Sharif began. And it started with the strangest sight anyone in ODA 595 had ever seen. The Northern Alliance cavalry assembled on a ridgeline overlooking the Taliban positions. Over 1,000 horsemen, armed with whatever weapons they could carry. Some had AK-47s, others had RPGs. A few had ancient bolt-action rifles from the Soviet era. They looked like something out of a history book. And then they charged. One of the Green Berets later described it as a Braveheart moment. A massive wave of horses and men pouring down the hillside toward enemy lines, screaming war cries, firing weapons. It was completely insane. It was also terrifyingly effective. The Taliban had expected a slow, methodical advance. Instead, they were facing 1,000 screaming riders closing the distance at full gallop. Machine guns opened fire, but couldn't target fast-moving cavalry effectively. Mortars dropped, but hit empty ground. And then the American bombs started falling. ODA 595 had split into pairs, each team with a laser designator and radio. They identified Taliban tanks, artillery positions, and command bunkers. Coordinates were transmitted to bombers circling overhead. Minutes later, 2,000-pound JDAMs were dropping from the sky. The explosions were apocalyptic. Tanks were flipped over by the shock waves. Buildings collapsed. Taliban fighters who'd felt safe in fortified positions suddenly realized there was no such thing as safety when the Americans could drop precision munitions anywhere, anytime. But the battle wasn't one-sided. Taliban forces had anti-aircraft guns and knew how to use them. A Green Beret on horseback made an easy target if you could draw a bead on him. Several ODA 595 members had close calls, bullets snapping past their heads, RPGs exploding nearby, shrapnel peppering their positions. The fighting continued for 2 days. Slowly, systematically, the Northern Alliance pushed into the city. Taliban positions were either destroyed by airstrikes or overrun by cavalry charges. Dostum's men fought block by block, house by house. The Green Berets moved with them, calling in strikes when needed, treating wounded when necessary, and occasionally engaging in direct firefights with their M4 rifles. November 10, 2001, Mazar-e-Sharif fell, and with it, the Taliban's control of northern Afghanistan collapsed. The victory was total. Taliban forces that didn't surrender fled south toward Kabul or east toward Pakistan. Thousands of prisoners were taken, weapons caches were captured, and the Northern Alliance, which had been a fragmented guerrilla movement just weeks earlier, suddenly controlled a major city and key supply routes from Central Asia. The impact was strategic. Once Mazar-e-Sharif fell, other Taliban positions became untenable. Without northern supply lines, their forces around Kabul were isolated. Within 2 weeks, Kabul itself would fall. The Taliban regime that had ruled Afghanistan for 5 years was collapsing in less than a month. ODA 595 had accomplished what military planners thought would take 2 years, and they'd done it with 0 casualties. All 12 Green Berets survived. Some had minor injuries, bumps, bruises, and saddle sores that would last for weeks, but no one was killed. No one was seriously wounded. In a mission where 80% casualties were expected, they'd beaten the odds completely. There were moments that stayed with them. One team member described a night when they'd bivouacked in a village, sleeping in a mud compound while local families brought them food. The hospitality was genuine. These were people who'd suffered under Taliban rule and saw the Americans as liberators. It was a reminder that the mission wasn't just about revenge for September 11th, it was about giving Afghans a chance at freedom. Another moment came when they buried a piece of the World Trade Center in Mazar-e-Sharif. A chunk of steel from the towers had been carried with them throughout the mission. When the city fell, they dug a hole and buried it as a memorial, a promise kept. The people who attacked New York were being hunted in these mountains, and the Americans weren't leaving until the job was done. But there were also darker moments. The Taliban prisoners taken at Mazar-e-Sharif were held in a fortress called Qalai-Jambi. On November 25th, a riot broke out. Hundreds of prisoners overwhelmed their guards and seized weapons. A CIA officer named Johnny Michael Spann was killed in the initial chaos, the first American combat death in Afghanistan. ODA 595 wasn't directly involved in suppressing the riot, but other special forces teams were. It took days of fighting, airstrikes, and even bombing runs before the prison was secured. It was a reminder that victory in Afghanistan was never clean. The enemy was fanatical. Allies were unreliable. And even when you won, the cost could be brutal. ODA 595 returned home as heroes, but the story of what they accomplished would take years to fully understand. The horse soldiers became legend. Photos of Green Berets on horseback circulated in news outlets. The image of American commandos fighting like 19th-century cavalry while directing 21st-century airstrikes captured the public imagination. It was proof that you didn't need massive invasions and hundreds of thousands of troops to win wars. You needed smart tactics, brave soldiers, and the right partnerships. In 2011, a statue called America's Response Monument was unveiled in New York City near Ground Zero. It depicted a Special Forces soldier on horseback, representing ODA 595 and the other horse soldier teams that liberated northern Afghanistan. Members of the team attended the ceremony. For many of them, it was overwhelming. They'd done their jobs. They'd completed the mission, but they were just soldiers. The hero worship felt strange. Some went on to write books. Doug Stanton published Horse Soldiers, the extraordinary story of a band of U.S. soldiers who rode to victory in Afghanistan in 2009. In 2018, it was adapted into the film 12 Strong, starring Chris Hemsworth. The movie took liberties with the story, but it captured the essential truth. A small group of men had done something extraordinary against impossible odds. Several members of ODA 595 started a bourbon company called Horse Soldier Bourbon. The bottle is shaped like a horse soldier, and part of the proceeds go to veteran charities. It was their way of keeping the story alive and supporting the military community. But the darker question lingered. What had they actually accomplished? Mazar-e-Sharif was liberated in 2001. The Taliban regime fell weeks later. American forces stayed in Afghanistan for 20 more years. And in August 2021, the Taliban retook the entire country in a matter of days. Mazar-e-Sharif fell again, this time without a fight. The Northern Alliance commanders who'd ridden with Ode 595 either fled to exile or were executed. Captain Mark Nutch, now retired, has spoken about this in interviews. He's proud of what his team did. They completed their mission flawlessly. But missions are tactical, wars are strategic, and Afghanistan was never going to be won by special forces teams on horseback. It needed political solutions, economic development, and genuine buy-in from the Afghan people. Those things never materialized. One team member put it simply, "We won every battle, but somewhere along the way we lost the war." Still, what Ode 595 accomplished in those 23 days remains extraordinary. 12 men, none of whom knew how to ride a horse when they started, liberated a major city and changed the course of a war. They proved that unconventional warfare could work. If it is in English, use a clear, natural American English accent. If it is in another language, use a clear, natural accent for that language. Read it at a normal pace. They showed that small teams with the right capabilities could accomplish what large armies couldn't, and they did it without losing a single soldier. In the long, bloody history of the war in Afghanistan, there aren't many victories that stand out as unambiguous successes. But those 3 weeks in October and November 2001, that was one of them. The horse soldiers rode into the history books. And their story remains a testament to what courage, creativity, and a little bit of crazy can accomplish when everything is on the line.